Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final webinar in the 2021 SAM webinar series. I'm Brian Mierletz, a researcher at NREL, and I'll be presenting on updates to the electricity bill calculator within the System Advisor model. This is the final webinar in our webinar series for 2021. Previous webinars covered the merchant plant financial model, the marine energy performance models, new battery model features, the new community solar financial model, and then today's, which is electricity bill calculator updates. You can find recordings of the previous webinars on the SAM website. If you have questions during the webinar, please type your question into the question box. Depending on which version of GoToMeeting you're using, that might look slightly different, but you can see that indicated on the slide here. Either one of my teammates will answer them by text during the presentation, or we will hold it to the end of the webinar to answer out loud. In case this is your first SAM webinar, SAM is the System Advisor model, which is the free computer software developed and distributed by the U.S. Department of Energy's National Renewable Energy Laboratory. SAM calculates a power system's energy output and uses that to project the power project's cash flow over the years of operation. This is covered in more detail in an introductory webinar that is also on the SAM website. In terms of the theme of the webinar today, this is sort of a sequel to a webinar that was given in 2017 on the residential and commercial financial models. A lot of what's in that previous webinar, as far as system sizing, downloading and modifying electric loads, and the cash loan financial model itself is still quite accurate. So this is just updating the portion of that webinar that deals with the electricity bill calculator. So we're sort of going to gloss over some of those topics with the bill calculator, with the financial model, and just do a deep dive into the bill calculator today. So with that, we'll do a quick summary of the residential and commercial financial model. We'll talk about the OpenEI utility rate database, and then get into the details of some of how SAM computes energy charges, some of SAM's billing and metering options, demand charges, and then a new feature, billing demand for kilowatt hour per kilowatt energy charges. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So if we pull up SAM, this is what the welcome screen on the current version looks like. I'll give the caveat that this is a development version of SAM. So we're showing you some new features today that are not yet in the publicly released version, and as such, they may be subject to change before the final version is released. We can share a link to the beta in the chat in case anyone wants to test these features, but just know they might not be fully tested and validated and ready for analysis just yet in the beta version. For the behind the meter financial models that we'll be looking at today, I'm going to click Start a New Project. First, I have to choose a technology model. A lot of these technology models are paired with the same financial models for financial analysis. Today, we'll be looking at the PV Watts technology model. And then the behind the meter financial models are under this distributed bar here. I'm going to be focusing on the commercial model today, but the same utility rate calculator is also used in third-party and front-of-meter systems. Third-party to calculate an electricity bill, and front-of-meter systems to calculate operating expenses as part of that plant's operation. So generally speaking, the behind-the-meter financial models are looking at using the generation to offset a building's electric load. And so that generation is specified by a solar resource file, the default here being a typical model year file for Phoenix, Arizona, and then a system design, which is specified on the system design page, and we're just going to be using the defaults for that for a little while. And that gets paired with an electric load that's specified on this page, and there's a default load profile with some details here. Again, previous webinars, like that 2017 webinar or a few of last summer's webinars, go into more detail on how to set these things up, but just getting the general idea that we're using generation to offset an electric load in order to reduce a building's utility bill. If we hit simulate, we can see that bill reduction in year one summarized here. So we have an electricity bill without system based on the load without system, an electricity bill with system, and then the net savings of the system is feeding into the net present value and other financial metrics. The cash flow tab provides a more year-by-year basis for this calculation over the entire analysis period. So those same metrics are computed every year and then summed over that analysis period in order to get those higher level metrics. So let's dive into how that bill is calculated. That's on this electricity rates page. So one way to populate this electricity rates page is to connect with the OpenEI utility rate database. So if I open that link here, this is a database maintained by NREL and a number of volunteer users in order to provide machine-readable forms of both US and international utility rates. So if we click Browse US Rates, we can see rates with recent updates, including some from earlier this week. And these are for, again, utilities all across the US, different sectors, and as well as some international rates. So you can click on these rates and see detailed information, such as some references to where the rate is coming from, and typically in a PDF rate sheet format, applicability of the rate, and demand and energy charges. But SAM also has a API call that you can utilize in order to download this rate and automatically apply it to the electricity rates page. So if we click this Search for Rates button, it will populate a list of all of the utility companies that are in the URDB. But you can also search by zip code. So since we have a default Phoenix weather file, you can put in the zip code for Phoenix, and then it will come up with Arizona Public Service Co. And if we click on that and get a list of available rates, you can see a number of rates here. In order to demonstrate some of the features, I'm going to choose this medium general service time of use rate. And then if I click download and apply utility rate, it will overwrite all of the fields in this utility rate window. So that's just a note to be careful about that. If you've made modifications within this utility rate window, you might want to use this save load rate data box or open a new case before downloading your rate. It's also worth noting that both SAM and the URDB use a simplified representation of rates. If we click on this description and applicability sheet here, it will give some of those details that we were seeing on the URDB page, as well as a link to the URDB page for this rate. So we can open that. And so then there's, again, the utility name, the rate name, description of the rate schedule. And one thing that I'll note here is that this is a living database, and sometimes utilities do things like change their URLs. So unfortunately, this particular rate has an out-of-date link for its URL, but I was able to go to Arizona Public Service's website and find the rate sheet. So this is the rate that we downloaded, and there's a whole bunch of different information here on basic service charges, demand charges in a lot of different categories, and energy charges. And so you'll actually note that if we look for numbers here that are per kilowatt hour, there's actually several different, about 3 different numbers here that would have to be added up per kilowatt hour. And if we go to the URDB, those have been consolidated into one rate. And the URDB also includes adjustments. So if you add up these 3 numbers, you get that 7.1 cents per kilowatt hour. But then there's also all of these adjustments that are included here that the folks who are populating the URDB have gone through all of these adjustment charges and added the relevant one here. Obviously, we encourage you to double check this. This is stuff that is entered by people and is therefore subject to the occasional human error. But for a preliminary analysis, it is available in this simplified and easier to understand format. One other caveat here is that there's a slight mismatch between how the URDB represents some elements of rates and what SAM is capable of representing. And that goes in both directions. URDB has some fields that SAM doesn't use, and SAM has some fields that aren't available yet in the URDB. So as an example of that, there's this relevant rate from Seattle. So if we select City of Seattle, Washington, and one feature that I didn't show earlier is this will automatically filter the rates by the type of system you selected versus residential and commercial. This show active box shows rates that are currently active. If you wanted to use a historical rate, you can uncheck this. And the particular rate that I want to show as an example here is a residential rate. So I can change this to residential and then use this filter feature to search for a term that I'm looking for, in this case, the residential shoreline rate. And if I download and apply this rate, I get this note that says this rate from the URDB contains items that SAM's electricity bill calculator does not consider. See unused items below. So if I scroll down to the bottom, there's this field called unused items. And if I expand that, I see that SAM does not model the fixed charge rate of 18.9 cents with dollars per day units. So this just gives you some hints on what attributes are included in URDB and included on the rate sheet that SAM doesn't model explicitly. This is a relatively straightforward example because you could just multiply this number by 30 and put it up here in the monthly fixed charged field. It'd be pretty close, right? That wouldn't be 100% accurate for every month, but it should be close enough. So that sort of thing is on the individual analyst in order to fit those corrections into the format differences. Obviously, we welcome your feedback in order to prioritize features on that sort of thing, but just wanted to give everyone the heads up that this red text is pretty important. So we can, with that, that covers SAM's interface with URDB. With that, we can dive into some energy charges. So let me go back to that Phoenix rate, since it has a little bit more interesting of a time of use structure. So if we look at energy charges, there's a couple of different things to note here. One is that we're able to represent time of use charges with both periods and tiers. This particular rate has 4 periods, a summer on peak and off peak, and a winter on peak and off peak, each of which has 1 tier. If I wanted to say increase the number of periods or tiers, I would go to this number of entries box here. I could say put in 8 and then go through and give every one of these a second tier. You'd want to say make this mass usage units, say 200 kilowatt hours, and then you put in some different price for this higher tier. Another thing to note with this interface is that the number of columns here depends on which metering and billing choice you specified. So for net billing, there is an explicit cell rate for each period. Switching to net metering, which we'll be defining these a little bit more in a few minutes. But switching to net metering takes away that explicit cell rate since all of the kilowatt hours are going to be receiving this compensation rate right here. Next up, if you needed to change a period in a tier, say the peak period got extended a little bit earlier in the day in the summer, you can select these and use your keyboard. The numbers 1 through 9 correspond to the numbers 1 through 9. And the letters A, B, and C correspond to 10, 11, and 12. And if you need a reminder or specific instructions as you're modifying that, you can click on this help button up here. And instructions for modifying time of use periods are way at the bottom under this defining weekday and weekend schedules. And this applies both to time of use periods and demand charges, which we'll be covering in a little bit more detail later. If I reset this and run the file, and we'll go back to the original rate structure there, we can see the outputs for this in a couple of different formats. So we have these data tables, which cover all of the different outputs SAM is capable of reporting in different categories sorted by how the data is reported. So I'm going to be spending a lot of time in a minute looking at monthly data, including things like the electricity bill with system. But a lot of the electricity rate data is broken down into the formats that are relevant for that data. So we have this electricity rate data by tier and period. And so, for example, we could see the energy charges in July and how these break down by period. So, for example, for this system in July, the energy charge was $476 in period one, tier one, and $1,300 in period two, tier one. If there was a second tier, that would appear between tier one and the total, and so on. An additional option for energy charges is to specify things on a time series basis. So we have the option to specify time series, both cell rates and buy rates. So if you check this box, it takes away the cell rate down here relative to the period, and then you can enter in the cell rates for every time step of the first year. So this would be an example of if you were buying at a retail rate and selling at a wholesale rate, you could represent that here. Conversely, depending on what market you're in, you may have hourly buy rates as well. So that works the same way. You can specify this here. This data array box allows you to specify, it defaults to specifying things on an hourly basis, but if you're working on a sub-hourly basis, you can specify this change time step option here in order to extend the length of this array and enter rates with additional detail. So that covers specifying energy charges. For billing and metering options, I have a quick summary slide that covers the different options. So there's 5 different options in SAM listed here. And what defines the differences between these are how the options for distributed generation compensation are calculated, and then how the billing is done on an hour by hour or time step by time step basis. So the first 2 options here, net energy metering, are doing the accounting in kilowatt hours on a monthly basis. So if you generate a whole bunch of energy during the day and export that to the grid and then draw from the grid at night, the accounting between those 2 will be done on a kilowatt hour basis and added up at the end of the month. These 2 options differ in when any excess generation is compensated. The net energy metering option uses a single annual true-up, which by default is paid out in December, but one of the new options we'll be covering today is paying that out at different times of year. Net energy metering with dollar credits will add everything up over the month and then apply those credits on a monthly basis. Net billing with carryover and buy all, sell all add things up on an hourly basis. So net billing will look for if there is net export to the grid over a time step, then it will apply the sell rate to that time step. If there's net import from the grid on a time step, then we'll apply the buy rate to that time step, and that occurs on actually a time step basis rather than, but the default is hourly. Net billing applies that compensation on a monthly basis, and then net billing with carryover uses that same annual true-up convention from net metering. And we'll get into some examples that make the difference between these a little bit more clear. And then finally, buy all and sell all assumes that the system being modeled has 2 meters. And so all of the electricity brought in from the grid or all of the load actually is assumed to be brought in from the grid and is charged at the buy rate, and all of the generation from the system is assumed to be sold back to the grid and is sold at the sell rate. And if you need to get into more detail with these beyond what we cover in today's examples, again, I recommend the help. So if you scroll down just a little bit and look at these metering and billing definitions, these are covered in far more detail than what we'll go through in this webinar, and relates the relevant outputs for each of these options, which we'll cover a little bit today. So I have a different file that I've been using to set up these examples so I can have some of the outputs pre-populated. This is again using the PV Watts commercial example with all of these different metering and billing options highlighted. So rather than starting from the top, in the way that Sam defines them, I'm going to go roughly from least complex to most complex. So we'll start with net billing. So here we've selected net billing. I've taken this default, or this rate that we've been looking at so far from Arizona Public Service, and then just added a cell rate of 2 cents per kilowatt hour, such that we have an example of a cell rate to look at these different options. So if we press simulate, we can look at the data tables, and I've pre-populated some of the relevant outputs for looking at the different metering and billing options in the data tables. So the first column is excess generation in terms of kilowatt hours per month. That'll be relevant to all of the options except for buy all, sell all. And so you can see this corresponds to this chart on the summary page, where there is the monthly energy and loads. The blue line is how much energy the system is generating. The gray line is the load of the system, and the difference between these two is summarized in this excess generation column. Next up is the energy charge with system before credits. So this is looking at all of the purchases from the grid before any of these credits are applied. So this would be the sum of all of the hours in which electricity is purchased from the grid multiplied by the relevant buy rate for that hour. Next is the net billing credit, which is relevant because we've selected net billing. And this is the dollars per month where the system was exporting energy to the grid multiplied by the relevant cell rate for that hour, which we've chosen a flat rate of 2 cents. And then in order to calculate the energy charge after credits, it's pretty straightforward. You just take the energy charge with system before credits, subtract the net billing credit, and then you'll get in this column all the way on the right, the energy charge with system in terms of dollars per month. There will be some other charges that factor into the utility bill, like fixed charges and demand charges that we'll discuss later. But I just want to focus on these energy charges before credits and energy charges with system in order to explain how these credits work in a little bit more detail. So the next option is net billing with rollover. So the only difference between this case and the previous case is we've selected this option here instead of net billing. And so what that does is it actually moves this net billing credit to the subsequent month. So instead of this here in the net billing case, you can see this $549.70 was applied to the bill in January. Here it's been carried over to February, and that continues for every month throughout the year. But then December's payment is applied as an annual true-up payment. So you actually end up getting 2 credits in December in this particular system. One of the big differences between these two metering and billing options is that for net billing, you can, if you end up generating more credits than you are billed for in the energy charge before system, you can get a negative energy credit on your bill that month, whereas net billing with rollover will cap it at that energy charge with system before credits. So to see an example of that, I can go over to the system size page, increase the system nameplate capacity to a 600 kilowatt DC system, and run the simulation again. And in this case, you can see some months like March through May, in which the net billing credit is greater than the energy charge before credits. And that means then there will be some months with a negative bill. So that's effectively simulating the utility cutting a check to the system in those months. Net billing with rollover, if we do the same thing, we'll increase the system size to 600 kilowatts DC, and then hit simulate. And then in this case, the net billing credit in each of these cases is capped. So those same months, April and May, in which we were exceeding the energy charge with system, that net billing credit has been capped. And then as a result, since these dollars are carried over throughout the month on a monthly basis, then this net annual true-up payment will increase as a result. So then one other thing to show as far with net billing with rollover is what happens if we change the true-up period. So again, the default true-up period lines up with the end of the year in December. If we change that to May, we'll get this really big annual true-up payment in May, and then the cycle will reset in June, and there will be no credit in June, and then credits will start accumulating throughout the year. When it doesn't line up with the calendar year, it's helpful to look at the monthly biannual outputs, which are in this electricity rate data by year category. So we can look at energy charge with system in that case, and we can see that these credits will zero out the bill in May and June every year, or sorry, April and May every year, and then continue on throughout the year. Similarly, we can see the net billing credits, accumulating for the beginning of the year, being 0 in June and continuing after that. And so, again, here, January in year 1 has 0 credits because we just started running the system, but January in year 2 will receive a credit from the previous December, and then that net annual true-up payment here is always appearing in May. So that's an example of changing this month for end of year true up, which applies to the net billing with carryover to next month, net metering with dollar credits, and net energy metering billing options. Next up is buy all, sell all. So this is the case where we're simulating 2 meters. And again, we've specified this 2-cent sell rate for all of the periods. So if we hit simulate, and look at these same data tables, the energy charge with system before credits has increased. And the reason for that is because all of the load is being subjected to the buy rate, as opposed to previously it was only the steps with net load. And then we have this column over here, buy all, sell all electricity sales to grid. And this is all of the generation being compensated at that 2 cents per kilowatt hour, as opposed to only the net generation. And then the net result of that tends to be a larger utility bill for this system in particular. But this is, again, one of the really straightforward ones where you're just taking the energy charge with system before credits, subtracting a different credit category, and then you end up with the final energy charge. All right, let's move on to net metering. So in this case, we've selected net energy metering here. The sell rate is not specified in a time of use period basis, and that's because the accounting for the excess generation is done on a kilowatt hour basis. Instead, we've specified that compensation here. This is the compensation rate for net excess generation at the end of the true-up period. If we press simulate, we can see in the data tables that in this case, the energy charge with system before credits has decreased pretty substantially compared to the last 3 cases that we were looking at. And the reason for this is because now we're doing accounting on a kilowatt hour basis. So since we're looking at things rather than, in this case, hour by hour, since we're looking at things on a monthly basis, those kilowatt hours exported during the day are able to make up for some of the kilowatt hours drawn from the grid at night, and it decreases the overall energy charge. We also see that there is some amount of cumulative credit that's rolling over month to month. So here, the excess credits accrued in January are compensating February through March and having those energy charges be very low. Then when we get to about June, we end up with a few months where the load exceeds the generation on a monthly basis. So this particular bill is spending down these credits, and then it increases again towards the end of the year. And at the end of the year, the remaining cumulative credits are multiplied by that compensation rate in order to get a net annual true-up payment at the end of the year. So the energy charge with system before credits is equal to the energy charge with system after credits, because this accounting is done on a kilowatt hour basis. One new option for net metering is to roll over the net excess compensation for future bills. The default option here, and what was true in previous versions of SAM, is this would effectively be like the utility cutting you a check at the end of the true-up period. If we check this box and press simulate again, now this net annual true-up payment has disappeared, and there is a box in net metering credits. So this category again, this net metering credit category is subject to the maximum of the energy charge with system before credits. And if we look at the electricity rate data by year again, we can see that the credit is applied at the end of the true-up period in December, and then continues to be used throughout the year for these next few months as needed. And then once we get to July, the generation exceeds the load and we run out of credits. Finally is net metering with dollar credits. So in this case, we're still doing net metering. So we're summing things up on a kilowatt hour basis. But then at the end of the month, this sell rate is applied to any kilowatt hours remaining in the relevant time of use buckets for that month. And then that's applied to the bill. So we can see that here. Now in this case, the net metering credit is set to a maximum of the net energy charge with system before credits, and this is subtracted out on a monthly basis. In this case, towards the end of the year, there aren't enough credits to cover the energy charge with system, so there is not a net true-up payment. But then here again, the energy charge with system before credits minus the net metering credits will be equal to the energy charge with system after credits. So that covers the metering and billing options. Are there any burning questions on what we've discussed so far?
Thanks, Brian. There aren't any questions at the moment, but we have the remaining time for a Q&A session. So
actually, there's a few more things.
Oh, sorry. Carry on.
Yep. Yeah, that was just a good pause point in case there were any questions so far. So there's a few things in previous versions of SAM that I'll just cover briefly. So I'm going to go back to this Arizona rate as it was actually implemented. Actually, that's a different rate. I'll use this one. That's fine. So if we go to let's see, the first one to cover is these fixed and minimum charges as well as annual escalation. So we talked about fixed charges a little bit before. This is just a monthly charge that appears in the utility bill every month. Minimum charges, the default floor here is 0, so that enforces some of the, rather than enforcing it on the energy charges, that would enforce some of the compensation rules that I was talking about earlier. So for example, if you had a monthly minimum charge of $10 and your net billing case had additional excess generation, you would still end up paying that $10 every month. In cases where there were credits with rollover, then additional credits would roll over to the subsequent month, but there would still be some minimum charge that has to be applied on either a monthly or annual basis. Next up is demand charges. These work in terms of the schedule components and the periods and tiers, a bit like the energy charges, except for one, they're charged on a per kilowatt basis instead of per kilowatt hour. That's based on the peak demand during a specified period in the rate sheet. The default for SAM is going to be whatever time step the simulation is run at. So for the system we're running here, it's going to be hourly, but often that's on a 15 or 30-minute basis in the rate sheet. And then additionally, there can be flat tiers that are specified on a monthly basis. We wouldn't want to have folks going through every single one of these to have to specify 12 different periods, so we provide this additional input for flat demand charges. And what that ends up looking like on the output side, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. Let me clear out some of the things that we were looking at for net metering here. So you can see demand charge. In this case, we have a time of use demand charge. So you can see that on a dollar basis on time of use with system. The flat demand charge for this particular rate is 0. And then you can also see the kilowatt hours per month specified here. Similarly to the energy data, there is demand data by period. So if we look at the demand charge with system, we can see how much of the demand charge was broken down between these two periods. So that covers demand charges. Lastly, we have a new feature that we implemented in partnership with some of the utilities that wanted to be able to analyze their own rates using SAM. So they asked us to implement this feature from their rates, which is a billing demand for energy charges. So let me go to one of the relevant rates here. which is Georgia Power's power and light medium rate. And if we apply that rate, we can see that we get a energy charge table populated with these kilowatt hours per kilowatt units. SAM supports a couple of different unit types. Up till now, I've been demoing everything in kilowatt hours. We'll talk about kilowatt hours per kilowatt here. And then there's also, you can do those on a daily basis rather than a monthly basis. And what these are used to do is define the relevant tiers. So for this particular rate, there's a seasonal component where there's a different rate in the summer and winter. And then there's also tiers which are specified on this kilowatt hours per kilowatt basis. And as an added layer of complexity, there's actually nested tiers here. So if we look at the rate sheet, it gives that in a little bit more English than what's on the SAM sheet. This first little subset of tiers is for the first 200 hours times the billing demand. So what that means is that if your billing demand was 200 kilowatts, then that would cover your first 40,000 kilowatt hours. So the first 3,000 kilowatt hours would be charged at this rate. The next 7,000 kilowatt hours would be charged at this rate. Based on that particular billing demand, the next 30,000 kilowatt hours would be charged at this rate. And then you jump to this tier, which is for demand between 200 to 400 times the billing demand. Using the example of a 200 kilowatt billing demand, that would be 40,000 to 80,000 kilowatt hours. So if we just run this in SAM, we can see that, so we have an output that talks about on a monthly basis, the billing demand for the kilowatt hour per kilowatt rates. And in this particular case, at least without system, it'll be a little bit different with system. That just matches, excuse me, the peak load in every month. So for example, May here is pretty close to that 200 kilowatts we were talking about. So you see 198 kilowatts here. You'll see 198 kilowatts specified as that billing demand. And then if we go to electricity data by tier and period for May, electricity usage, we can see that we have those. Actually, let me do this without system because that'll be a little bit closer to the example I was, oh dang, where did that go? So this is a little bit closer to the example that I was talking about earlier, where the first 10,000 kilowatt hours go to these first tiers, and then these subsequent tiers, I'm looking at March, not May, that's the difference, there we go. So go to these first tiers, and these subsequent tiers are done on that billing demand basis. As an added level of complexity, there are alternative ways to compute that billing demand. So if we go back to the rate sheet and we scroll down to the determination of billing demand section, here we talk about, so it's the highest 30-minute kilowatt measurement. There's some seasonality that we'll talk through in a minute. Some months the current actual demand counts, some months it doesn't, and this is based on the preceding 11 months. And then there's also some minimums on that billing demand. So we've implemented a user interface for this in SAM, and this is one of those features that's implemented in SAM, but not yet implemented in the utility rate database. So you'll have to read the rate sheet and populate these fields accordingly. So if I check this box, this opens up all of these input fields. This look back period of 11 months means that the previous 11 months are counted in the computation of the billing demand. For the particular rate sheet we were looking at, the minimum billing demand was 30 kilowatts, so I'll go ahead and change that. For the winter months, the percentage applied in this computation is 60%. So 60% of the peak demand in that month will be applied to the billing demand. In the summer months, it's 95, and then the greatest of all of these numbers in the previous 11 months is used at the billing demand. In some months, that month's peak demand can override the billing demand. So if, for example, in July, that month's peak demand was greater than 95% of June's demand, that month's demand would be used. In January, that would not be true. And then one additional feature that you have to consider when simulating this type of rate in SAM is what was the year zero load, since that will inform the year one billing demand. So we provide two options here. One is you can edit the values and enter in your own values for the peak demands, which that will be fed into this case. And the other option is to check this box, in which case the year one billing demand will be calculated based on a year zero look back period using the peaks without system. So let's have a look at how this setup affects the relevant billing demands. So if we go back to that monthly data, you see that these have pretty much all gone up. January is now looking at 260 kilowatt billing demand based on the demand in year zero's summer. July is the only month that exceeds the billing demand, and pretty much every other month is 95% of July. So that's one example of how this affects that. And then if we look at the electricity usage with system and how that's sorted into tiers, previously we had a number of, I think, about 27,000 kilowatt hours in tier 3. Based on these new billing demands, that has been increased to about 42,000 kilowatt hours in tier 3. So we're shifting things between tiers 3 and 4 based on applying a different billing demand. So that covers the new feature of billing demand for energy charges. I wanted to mention a few upcoming features. So we are planning for the fall release to include ratchets on demand charges, which are sort of similar to that look back period for billing demand. It is a feature that's supported in the URDB, but not SAM. Unfortunately, we couldn't get it done in time for the webinar, but we are planning on including it in the fall release. If you want to see the full list of features that we've prioritized, we have an issues list on GitHub, and there's an electricity rates filter for that issues list. We do encourage you to keep giving us feedback on things that you can't model with our utility bill calculator or things that aren't clear, such that we can continue to prioritize and make improvements. And with that, thank you for listening, and we can go to the Q&A.
Great, thank you, Brian. I think one clarification, there's been a couple of questions about different versions of SAM. So I just wanted to make clear that what SAM demonstrated here, most of those features are in the current version of SAM, which is available for download on the SAM website. The billing demand for energy charge is the main new feature that is in this beta version. So if you're interested in investigating that feature and perhaps providing us feedback on it, you can find it in the beta version. But as Brian mentioned, this is a fairly specific feature for just a few utilities in the US, so it may not be relevant for most of your work. Otherwise, the remaining features are available in the current version.
Yeah, the month for true-up period and the rollover for net excess compensation are new as of 2020.11.29, which is the currently released version.
So I think we've got 15 minutes or so left in the scheduled time. So if you have a question, feel free to type it in the chat box, or you could also raise your hand, and then we can unmute you and give you an opportunity to ask a question by voice. So we'll just wait a few minutes to give folks a chance to collect their thoughts. The next new release of SAM is scheduled for fall 2021, maybe late fall, early winter, hopefully by November. We're working hard on a number of new features, and we'll get it released as soon as we can. On the events page of the SAM website is a list of recordings to webinars that we've given over the summer that provide a good summary of the new features that will be added in this fall 2021 version. So you can if you're curious, you can investigate those. Let's see. I'm not seeing any raised hands or questions. We'll wait a few more minutes. If there aren't any questions, we'll go ahead and sign off and let everyone get back to their day. I guess the other thing I could mention, I think Brian mentioned at the very beginning, that this webinar is sort of a update to an earlier one that we gave, I think, in 2017. That 2017 webinar goes over some things like working with load data and some of the other aspects of the residential and commercial financial models that Brian didn't cover because we've already got it covered here. So it might be worth checking out that video if you're new to these electricity bill calculations in SAM. All right, it doesn't look like there are any questions, so I think we'll go ahead and sign off. We will be posting a recording of this webinar on the page here of the SAM website that Brian is showing. And we'll also have a copy up on the events page. We'll keep the list of recent recordings up there so people can find them easily. And you can look around the website for videos on various topics. If you have questions, would like to follow up on anything that we discussed today, please feel free to post a question on the SAM forum. You can also send us an email at sam.support@nrel.gov. But the forum is a great place to post questions because then other people can see them and respond as well. So thank you, Brian, for the webinar today, and thanks everyone for calling in. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you. Goodbye.